Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for coming. Just to get this out of the way, English is not my first language. Like many of you, I speak another language first, and I've noticed that when I speak foreign languages, I need to concentrate more, and I get this really grumpy look on my face, which is not good when you are a happiness researcher, right? Because if you look sad, you get fired. Also, I'm fully aware that when people hear that I work with happiness research, they imagine that our office home in Copenhagen looks somewhat like this, and we have a room full of puppies and a room full of ice cream. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It looks more like this. So we look at a lot of numbers, we look at a lot of data, and we're coming from the position that we want to have a scientific approach to happiness, well-being, quality of life. So when we know what we know from happiness research, how should we design our policies differently, our cities differently, our workplaces differently, and essentially our lives differently? So that's our aim. And as I mentioned an hour ago in the plenary room, I'm trying to work with three questions. I'm trying to figure out how we can measure the good life, how we can measure happiness. Secondly, why some people are happier than others. And thirdly, how we can improve quality of life. So I've dedicated my career to those questions. It's what I'll be working on for the next 30 or 40 years. And it's also some of those things I'll be talking about today. I'll also give you an idea to how companies can start to work with happiness and well-being metrics, and also to give you an overview of what is going on globally with happiness surveys, happiness metrics. Because I think for this conference, I would like you to reconsider how we actually measure progress in our societies, but also how we measure success in our lives. So let's dive into it. For me, these are really exciting times to be a happiness researcher, because we're seeing more and more governments, cities, international organizations embracing new and softer measures of progress. So for us, it was a big leap forward that the United Nations passed a happiness resolution back in 2011. The UN also commissions the World Happiness Reports, one of these rankings, as Eric mentioned before, that Denmark often do quite well in, together with the other Scandinavian or Nordic countries. We now also have an International Day of Happiness. It's March 20th, sort of in between light and darkness in a lot of places. So this was 2011. Since then, we now have a range of governments that are measuring their progress in new ways. Instead of just looking at, are we getting richer as a society, are our GDP per capita increasing, more governments are now asking, are people's lives improving? Are we improving quality of life? So I think in Europe, the country that have gone the furthest is the United Kingdom. So every year, the Office of National Statistics compiles data, collects data from around 200,000 people in the UK, and can see how are policies impacting well-being for people, and where in the UK are people more or less happy. A lot of the inspiration actually comes from Asia, from the small country of Bhutan. How many of you have actually heard of Bhutan? Well done. Okay, for those two of you that hasn't, it's a small country, even smaller than Denmark, 700,000 people in the eastern Himalayas. But what is fascinating about Bhutan is that they, since the beginning of the 70s, have navigated with something they call gross national happiness. So instead of looking at gross national product, every political decision is based on, is this going to improve happiness for our people? It was also it was Bhutan that put happiness on the agenda for the UN. So one of the most recent developments comes from the Middle East. So the woman on the right is Uhud al-Rumi, and she's the Minister of State for Happiness and Well-being in the United Arab Emirates. So currently the UAE ranks around 20th place in the World Happiness Report, and Uhud's job is to get them to top 5 by 2021. And obviously there's a lot of challenges. Like in many other countries, we see big gaps in well-being levels. There's a large inequality when it comes to well-being in a lot of countries. But I think it's fascinating to see one of the richest countries in the world, 7th richest actually, also have the tallest skyscraper in the world, now also have the ambition to be one of the happiest countries in the world. So the most recent development comes from New Zealand. Now, last year it was decided that every proposal that goes towards the finance ministry has to have an assessment of how this policy will impact well-being for New Zealanders. I think one of the reasons why New Zealand is pioneering in using these methods is that New Zealand experiences that a lot of people are moving to New Zealand from richer countries, for instance from the UK, because they want to experience a higher quality of life. So New Zealand feels that this measure is actually better capturing what's going on for people than conventional GDP measures. I think another reason why we see more governments looking at these well-being measures is that they see how conventional measures like the GDP per capita fall short of detecting what is going on in the public. So if we look at Egypt, if we look at Tunisia, in the 5-year period leading up to the revolution or the Arab Spring in 2011, if we look at the GDP levels, things look like they're going fine. There's an increase of 33% in Egypt, also in Tunisia. So if we only look at those metrics, things are going well. But if we look at the share of people that feels that their lives are flourishing, that life is good, we see that number drop to 1/3. So the OECD, this is from one of their reports, concludes that this is actually a better metric to capture what is going on in the public. And the OECD also concludes that these subjective well-being measures are valid and reliable and can be used to inform policymaking. So that's where we come in. And we also actually experience these years that more and more people are feeling that we have gotten richer over the past decades without necessarily getting happier. And I think South Korea in many ways is the poster child for that feeling or that experience. So this is what Seoul used to look like 60 years ago. I was there last year, now it looks like this. And as many of you know, they have had this tremendous growth over the past 5 or 6 decades and gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest. And that's an amazing achievement. The trouble is that South Korea, along with a lot of other countries, are struggling with converting that wealth into well-being. So we see massive challenges in terms of mental health, in terms of increasing pressure, especially on the young generation. There is now a term called happiness refugees from South Korea going towards the US or Europe in search of a better balance between work and life. And South Korea also have the unfortunate record in terms of suicide rate in OECD. So interestingly, the country we get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute is South Korea. And to me that's good news because there is a realization that the way we've been designing our policies, the way we've been measuring progress is perhaps not the right route. So that's why we need to look at what are countries, what are cities, what are policymakers doing right in order to improve happiness. But first, we need to solve one of my core challenges, and that is how we measure happiness. I should probably also mention that we will have time for questions in the end. This is usually a subject that prompts a lot of questions. I'll make sure we have 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this talk. So how to measure happiness? It has already given me a lot of gray hair, or as I like to call the color, executive blonde. It is challenging, it is difficult, but I think that people sometimes mistake difficult with impossible, and I don't think it is that. So what we do is we acknowledge that whether you talk about well-being, happiness, quality of life, that's a wide umbrella term. So Eric, he has one definition of what happiness is. I might have another one. And that's fine. But what we need to do when we look upon sort of these broad, complex umbrella terms is, of course, break them down and look at the different components. It's also what you guys do when you look at your businesses, how that business is doing. It's also what we do when we look at the economy. If we were to talk about how's the South African economy doing, we could talk about GDP per capita, we can talk about inflation rates, unemployment rates, growth, and so on. And that gives us a language to assess how is the South African economy doing. So that's also what we need to do with happiness. Break it down and look at different components. So when we and other scientists look at well-being or happiness, we look at least 3 different dimensions. So first we look at life satisfaction. And that is essentially a question where we ask people directly, how satisfied are you with your life? So take a step back, consider the worst possible life you could lead, the best possible life you could lead. On a scale from 0 to 10, where do you feel you stand right now? It's a very stable answer people give us. They usually answer the same today as they did 2 months ago. Another dimension is called the affective dimension. Now that is much more about what kind of emotions we experience on a daily basis. And we look both at positive and negative emotions. And we look at a specific point in time. So we would ask, yesterday, did you feel happy, lonely, sad, angry, worried, stressed, and so on? That's very volatile. We can actually see there is a weekend effect on the affective dimension. No big surprise, people are happier on Saturdays than they are on Mondays and Tuesdays. And we can also see, of course, that these 2 dimensions are linked. If you have an everyday with a lot of positive emotions, you probably also report higher levels of life satisfaction. Now the 3rd dimension is called the eudaimonic dimension. And that's just a fancy ancient Greek word for happiness. So it's what Aristotle used for the good life. And for Aristotle, the good life was the meaningful life. So here we're looking at whether people have a strong sense of purpose or meaning in life. And then we can start to see which factors impact which dimension. And some factors impact all dimensions. For example, our relationships, the strength of our friendships, the strength of our communities, the strength of our marriage impacts all 3 dimensions. I already mentioned weekdays. That seems to have an impact on the affective dimension. It does not have an impact on the other dimensions. Having kids have a tremendously wonderful impact on the sense of purpose, and they have sort of mixed results and mixed impacts on the other dimensions. I'll get back to that later. We can also see, and I think this is some of the surprising things in happiness research, we can see when it comes to life satisfaction that there is a genetic component. So we're simply born more or less happy. And we know this from twin studies. So the University of Minnesota in the US have a really cool twin register, also from a period in the US where it was allowed for 2 different sets of parents to adopt 1 twin each. So there we have identical genetic material brought up under different circumstances. And we can see when we have non-identical twins, there's no correlation between their happiness levels. But when we have identical twins, even though one might be employed and married and the other one might be unemployed and divorced, we see that there is a correlation between their happiness levels. We can also see when it comes to life satisfaction that age matter. So when we look at the relationship, it's sort of a U shape throughout our life. So we're quite happy, or we're very happy, when we're young, and then it sort of goes downhill to mid-40s. I'm headed rapidly downhill these years. And then it looks like it's going up when we're reaching our 50s and 60s and 70s. There's some differences between countries, and there's some differences between men and women. But on average, we see a U-shaped curve. Now, that looks like a good thing, that we get happier as we get older. But we can also see when it comes to life satisfaction that there is a relationship between health and happiness. And obviously, if we become sick, we are less happy. But we can also see the reverse causality, that happiness keeps people healthy. There's a lower mortality rate among happier people. And that means when you follow a group of people, over time, since there's a higher mortality rate, the unhappy ones dies off faster, and that increases the average. So that's the bad news on that one. But we are starting to map more and more in terms of which factors impact what. And we apply these simple principles. We break happiness down, we look at different components. And then we also say, well, yes, happiness is subjective. There's nothing wrong with that. We study a lot of things that are subjective: loneliness, stress, depression, anxiety. We could also study happiness. I don't see any evidence that it should be more difficult to try and study and quantify a positive emotion compared to a negative emotion. And to me, there's actually also only one person who can tell us whether Eric is happy or not, and that is Eric. So it's his assessment that I'm interested in. So that's what we're trying to put at the core of what we're trying to understand. And then, and this is very important, we look for change. So what we do is we like to follow people over time. And not in a sort of creepy stalker kind of way, but in a scientific way where we have longitudinal studies. Because otherwise, we could look at the data, and if we only look at a specific point of time and asked 100,000 people around the world how happy they are, and then looked at their civil status, we would see, okay, people who are married are on average more satisfied with life. They're happier. But is that because we get happy from marriage, or is it the other way around, that those people who are happy, positive, optimistic, have an easier time attracting a partner? That is why we need to follow people over time. And we've done that in Germany, in the UK. 10,000 people have been followed over decades. And then we can start to see, okay, over 10 years, a lot of things happen. People get fired, people get employed, people get promoted, people get married, people get divorced, people have kids. And what happens, perhaps for those 1,700 people who get married during that decade? And here we can see the impact that getting fired has on life satisfaction. So the firing happens in year 0, and as you can see, no big surprise, there's a big drop in life satisfaction also in year 4 after people have become unemployed. This is unsurprising. We lose income, we lose a part of our identity, and we also lose a big circle of our social relationships. And this is actually one of the areas where people don't bounce back. We see for other setbacks in life, like divorce, people bounce back after 2 to 3 years. But this remains a sort of permanent underminer of well-being. And here we have the effect of marriage. So marriage happens in year 0. This is the average effect. Women are red and men are blue. And as you can see, even before the marriage happens, 2 years before, life satisfaction starts to go up, right? You meet that special someone, all right, you're also a member of the YPO. Me too, let's get married. And then it sort of peaks shortly after marriage, and then we sort of adapt to marriage over time. But we can actually see that both things were true, which I talked about before. Yes, there is a boost in happiness that is also sustainable throughout life, but we can also see that the reverse was also true, that those people that did get married in our study were also slightly happier in the beginning of the study. So this is why we like to follow people over time to understand what is the cause and what is the effect of some of these measures. We get more and more data, we get better and better data in these longitudinal studies. Also because scientists are starting to apply phones, right? So in the UK, there's a great study, Mappiness, that have collected data from more than 65,000 people in the UK. And every day, up to 3 times a day, they're asked, how happy are you? But they're also asked, where are you? What are you doing? Who are you with? I actually had an ex-girlfriend who used to text me the same questions. She didn't collect the data, though. But because of these studies, we can now also combine them with objective data. So because of the, for example, GPS in our phones, we can start to see when, for example, the soccer team Manchester United plays, some people are at the stadium with the GPS traction. And if people are at the stadium every time Manchester United plays, there is a good chance that those are Manchester United fans. And then we can start to see when Manchester United wins, how long does it impact and how does it impact people's emotions. And no big surprise, when your team wins, you are happier for about 4 hours. We can also integrate data from bookmakers. So if your team was expected to lose and they win, there's a bigger bump in happiness. So I think these are some really, really cool studies where we combine subjective and objective data. We can then also start to see which activities bring more or less happiness to people. Being ill, home in bed is the worst activity in terms of bringing unhappiness. Any guesses on what number 2 is on the list of unhappy activities? Death. They stopped to report. Right, could be, yes. There's not so many data points for that. But no, it's work. Unfortunately, because I mean we spend so much time at work, I think it's something where we need to reconsider how to design our workplaces. I think our workplaces should be a source of joy and not necessarily of misery. We can also see what day of the year are people happiest. No big surprise. Christmas Day in the UK, 2016 was the happiest day. Any guesses on what the unhappiest day in the United Kingdom was in 2016? A lot of Brexits. Brexit was up there. It was in 4th place. The reason why it's not all the way at the top is, of course, that the majority of people thought it was a good thing. But it's also shows the issue of that the results is only as good as the data, because we are collecting, or the scientists here are collecting data via the phone. Young people are more inclined to have a smartphone, therefore they have more young people in the study, and therefore Brexit is higher up than it should be if it was fully representative. No, so the unhappiest day in 2016 in the UK was November 9th, because Europe woke up and there had been an election in the US. But to me, this is wonderful because it shows that we can actually detect political events in our data. But it also shows one of the challenges we have. It's fine that we can sort of see the impact that different political events and different events have on people's lives, but we also don't want our metrics to be too sensitive. Like when we're trying to detect earthquakes, we don't want something that goes off if there's a truck going by. And I think our challenge now is to find that right balance, because we can also see life satisfaction, the first dimension I talked about before. It's quite difficult to move the needle on that one. You know, it needs to be a big positive or negative thing that impacts your life in order for you to report a higher or lower number. So we need something that captures what is important to people, but also not something at the same time that is influenced by too much noise, like the weather, what day of the week it is, or what happens in the White House. So that brings us to why is it that some countries are happier than others? And it was actually that question that got me into happiness research. 6 years ago, I was looking at the different rankings of well-being and happiness and thought, why are the Scandinavian countries often doing quite well? And here we have the 6 published World Happiness Reports so far. There'll be another one out in about 2 weeks. So the World Happiness Report, it's very important to underline, measures the first dimension. It's based on life satisfaction. So if we measured some of the other dimensions, we would see different results. So the Nordic countries often do quite well on life satisfaction, on overall happiness, together with New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Austria, and the Netherlands. There's 155 countries in the World Happiness Report. The least happy countries are, unsurprisingly, countries like Syria, Afghanistan. We can also see the countries that have dropped the most from the first report to the last report are countries like Syria, but also Venezuela. South Africa is around 100th place. The US is around 18, but have been dropping quite a bit in the past few years. But it's also important to underline that these rankings are based on averages, right? We ask 3,000 people in different countries, for example, how happy they are with life overall, and then we calculate a national average. And then you have one country that comes out on top. And that country is often called the happiest country in the world. I like sometimes to say perhaps it's the least unhappy country in the world, because I think that's also part of the explanation why the Nordic countries do quite well. I think the Nordic model is quite good at reducing causes for unhappiness. That brings up the bottom, that increases the average, and that's why they come out on top. So this is averages, and recently we see a movement also to look at well-being levels and happiness levels from an equality point of view. And I think this is really good, because one thing is the average, another thing is the distribution. So reasons for the Nordic countries doing quite well? Yes, GDP levels matter. We can see, on average, richer countries are happier. The red line you have in the middle is the average relationship between wealth and happiness. It also shows you that if you are a country below that line, like we see South Africa is, you should actually be higher up when we look at the GDP levels on happiness. So what this means is that some countries are better at converting wealth into well-being, getting bang for their buck. And those countries are above the red line. So those countries are, again, some of the Nordic countries, or all of the Nordic countries. So they are good at investing their resources, their finances, in the right places that delivers quality of life to people. We can also see at the individual level, when we look at people, there is a relationship between money and happiness. So it's only in Hollywood movies, there's no connection. When we look at the data, there is. But to the right, you'll have a high income, to the left, low income, and upwards, you'll have the level of happiness. And I think it's very important to underline that, of course, there's no guarantee for happiness if you are wealthy. The connection here is if you are without money, that's a cause for unhappiness. It's a cause for worry, it's a cause for stress. So what we see, like with everything else, is that there is a diminishing marginal utility. The more we have of something, the less marginal pleasure we get out of it, right? The first time you go to the buffet down here, wonderful. Time number 8, not so great, right? And it's the same with money and happiness. The more we have of something, the less impact it has on our quality of life. People already making a lot of money, if they get additional $100 per month, you buy a more expensive bottle of wine. So to me, and I know I'm heavily influenced by my Nordic roots and progressive taxation system, but to me this is an argument for that. So the reason why we then not get happier when we get richer, when we can see that richer countries are happier and richer people are happier, is a paradox. Because you would think, okay, if richer countries are happier, if richer people are happier, then when we get richer, why don't we necessarily get happier? And one of the reasons for that is that we care about our relative position. So when we look at the data, we can see that people care not only about absolute income, how much am I able to consume, but they care about relative income. So how much money am I making compared to my family, my peers from school, my neighbors, and so on. So bluntly put, you are happy driving your BMW, and then suddenly the neighbor drives up in a Ferrari, then the BMW is not so great anymore. So we see that also in the data. If everybody just doubles their income, we're still stuck in the same place in the social hierarchy. Another reason why we don't necessarily get happier as we get richer is something we call the hedonic treadmill. And that means that we constantly raise the bar for what we feel we need in order to be happy. And I think especially for people like you, the ambitious type, there's always a higher number. And ambition is great, it pushes us forward, it's what brings us to Mars, but it can also be tough to constantly raise the bar for what we're satisfied with. But these are some of the reasons why we don't necessarily get happier as we get richer. So this is also why the Nordic countries are relatively good at converting wealth into well-being, reducing causes for unhappiness, investing in healthcare, investing in social security, and allowing all people to go to university. It's also the reason why the Nordic countries are Bernie Sanders' wet dream. We love taxes. I pay around 50% of my income in tax, and together with 9 out of 10 Danes, I say I'm happy to pay those taxes. And I think it's because we experience that we get a lot in return for those taxes. And it's seen as a collective investment in quality of life. And of course, this is also connected with the fact that there is good governance, there is low corruption. So what is paid into the public pool is fed back to people in terms of institutions, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, and so on. So that's also why I was really happy to hear the president last night talk about the need for reducing corruption around the world. It is one of the leading causes why a lot of countries are not doing better than they should, according to GDP levels in the World Happiness Report. So that also taps into another reason why the Nordic countries are doing well. There is extremely high levels of trust in the Nordic countries, in part due to low levels of corruption. So trust towards government, trust towards business. It's also why we are less inclined to draft and sign contracts when we do business. That lowers the transaction costs, makes business easier and more smooth. And trust, like happiness, can also be difficult to measure. We sometimes just ask people directly, do you feel that most people can be trusted? Or can't you become too careful when it comes to strangers? That's one way to do it, and we see some really high levels among the OECD countries in Northern Europe. Another way to do it would to go around cities and see, like in Copenhagen, a lot of people leave their kids outside where they're inside having a cup of coffee. That's a manifestation of trust. This is midsummer. No. So even in the wintertime, like this is, people leave their kids outside. A better way to measure trust or trustworthiness is actually using wallets. So social scientists have gone around cities with wallets containing cash, a day's worth of pay, and business card or some sort of ID, and then drop the wallet on the street, and then see how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. So what do you think the global average is? How many wallets, percentage-wise, do you think would be returned? 20%? 70%? 80%? Okay, with the money intact? I like you. You're optimists. It's very good. My kind of people. No. So 50% of the wallets are returned with the money intact on the global average. But I think this is one of the interesting studies, again, where we sort of combine subjective and objective data. It's also a quite expensive study to do. Some more in some countries than others. But high levels of trust, high levels of trustworthiness leads to high levels of happiness. We can also see those countries that are good at securing a good balance between work and life report higher levels of happiness. It's also a common story I hear when people move to Copenhagen or Stockholm or Oslo, that quality of life increases because there is a better balance between work and life. And that brings me to the point I was mentioning before, the impact that kids have on life satisfaction. So remember I said they're great for purpose, they're great for meaning in life. There's mixed results in life satisfaction. So the next graph, to me, is one of the most interesting graphs I've seen in recent years. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but here we have what is called the parental happiness gap. Across different countries, we look at, are people with or without kids happier, right? So the bad news, we start to the right. In the US, parents are 12% less happy than people without kids. On the good side, we have Portugal. Here, people with kids, parents, are 8% happier than people without kids. Now, is that because the Portuguese kids are nicer than the American kids? No, of course not. So what you'll see is also Portugal, Spain are high up. The reason for that is likely that Southern European culture around family is different from also my culture. Instead of being two stressed out parents trying to make logistics work, there's usually a lot more involvement with the grandparents. So instead of being two, you are a team of 6 that tries to juggle everything. So there's a cultural explanation, but you also see Norway, Sweden, and Finland, their parents are happier. In Denmark, parents are less happy. But the reason why the other Nordic countries, their parents is happier is because of the policies. Because of the policies around being a family. So there are family-friendly policies. Denmark has worse family-friendly policies than, for instance, Sweden. We have the right to take the first day off when our kid is sick, but on day 2, you sort of have to figure out what to do. In Sweden, on an annual basis, they have the right to take 60 days off if your kid is sick, and they can play around with them as they do. So that's why we see this pattern, culture and policies. And of course, in a perfect world, we have Portuguese grandparents and Swedish family-friendly policies. But to me, this is interesting to see how kids play a different role in terms of happiness in different countries. But yes, again, the most successful countries to me is those that understand that we need to reconsider how we measure progress, how we evaluate our policies, and how we can most efficiently convert wealth into well-being. And I think the Nordic countries have part of the solution when it comes to that. I also, just quickly, so we have time for questions, wanted to address how we see companies also pioneering this field of happiness and well-being. So one company we are working with is called Valcon. It's a consultancy with around 200 employees based in Copenhagen. And they have allowed the Happiness Research Institute to turn them into a live happiness lab. So their ambition is to become the company with the happiest employees in the world. We started 6 months ago measuring well-being levels, happiness levels among their employees, and now are trying out different interventions, different experiments. What can we do to improve happiness levels for the employees? And we're measuring a lot of things. We're measuring not just happiness or job satisfaction, but we're measuring self-esteem, stress, loneliness. And it's also, I think, a constant sort of discussion, how far into people's private lives can we go? So that's one of the challenges we are working with. So some of the interventions that have been introduced in the past 6 months throughout the company are, because we could see that loneliness was an important factor, is social clubs, it's running clubs, it's mindfulness exercises, it's a closer connection between the manager and the employee in terms of one-on-ones, in terms of feedback. So where we are now is that we have concluded the sort of second big study among the employees, and the results are that some of the employees today are less happy, 28%, than when we started. But fortunately, more people, 34%, are happier. A lot of them are, of course, at the same level they were at the beginning of the study. As mentioned, it takes a lot to move the needle for life satisfaction, with this is representative of. But to me, this is the very important first step, that we start to measure what is going on among employees and start to test and experiment different interventions. Which levers, which buttons can we press and pull that has a positive impact on people's well-being? So I think this is where companies, I would encourage them to go. Start measuring, start understanding how can we create good conditions for people's lives at the workplaces. How can we design our companies so people will flourish? And how do we also consider, how do we measure success? And the great news from happiness research is that if we care about our employees, if we do improve their job satisfaction and life satisfaction, we do see increases in productivity and a reduction in staff turnover. So I think there's also a good business case to be made for happiness. So we have about 7 minutes for questions. There's already some hands up there. I know we have a couple of people with microphones. Maybe we could also get the lights up in the room. Maybe we could. There is a... Yeah? Okay, great. Yes, we have one gentleman there.
Actually, have you ever measured or correlation between, first of all, Bilal from Morocco, correlation between the happiness level and capacity of accepting or embracing life difficulties or challenges?
So, no. So we haven't studied that. I would also love to hear your ideas to how we could measure that. I think the closest thing I can come to what have been studied is a future perspective on people's happiness. So a lot of the time we ask them, how satisfied are you with life right now? Now, more and more studies are also including a future happiness question. So one thing is how happy you are right now. Another thing is how happy do you expect to be 5 years from now? And that gives us a little bit of light, I think, on what you are asking for. It gives us the level of optimism that people have. And I think you can endure a lot. And I think there is a lot of resilience if you believe life will be better 5 years from now. What we see when we look, there's a huge data set on this through Gallup, is that the most optimistic people are young people. So there is a gap of 1 point on an 11-point scale between now and 5 years from now. So young people expect life will be amazing 5 years from now. People my age, it's probably going to be the same. We can also see that in the bigger cities, people also have a higher level of optimism. And that might, again, have something to do with, it's random where we are born, but it's not random where we choose to live. So the big cities attract ambitious people, people that are optimists, people that expect that life can be much better 5 years from now. So I think that's the closest answer I can give to that. But I would love afterwards to hear your input to how we can measure that. We have a second question there.
Yes,
yeah.
My name is Armando Beltran in Mexico. While you show that the Nordic countries are the happiest, I also have probably heard you or read you that you have the highest suicidal rates. And if that's the case, is that because of the comparison paradigm that you showed? And then the second one, you didn't show Bhutan. And while that was the original country that started measuring it, and I'd like any comments on that.
Okay, let's start with Bhutan. Bhutan is around place 80 in the World Happiness Report. So they're sort of in the middle of the race, but they're doing better than countries with a similar socioeconomic situation, Bangladesh. So I think we can see that because of their focus, they are getting more bang for their buck when it comes to happiness. So they're doing quite well. The suicide rate, it's good you bring it up because a lot of people think that Denmark has a high suicide rate. We used to have. So we used to have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. In 1980, the suicide rate was 32 per 100,000. Today, it is 9 per 100,000. So actually today, Denmark is in place 106 when you look at suicide rates. So it's Sri Lanka that has the highest suicide rate in the world today, and if you look at OECD countries, it's South Korea. But a lot of people still think it's high. Of course, a 9 per 100,000 is still too high. And I mean, I wanted, of course we all do, to have it even further. And I think the reason why it's not zero is perhaps also because of what you're saying, because of the social comparison. So we do think there is some evidence that suggests that it can be more difficult to be unhappy in an otherwise happy society. And actually, if you look at the individual US states, 50 states, states with a higher life satisfaction, like Hawaii, also have slightly higher suicide rates. And part of it might be exactly to what you describe, that we do make social comparisons. So if everybody around me is also happy and I'm not, then it could be a tougher contrast. You were from Mexico? Yeah. I spent a few months in Mexico a few years ago, also because I think it's super interesting that the Latin American countries are always doing really well when it comes to life satisfaction and also actually the affective dimension. When we look at the socioeconomic levels, you are much higher than you should be. And it's something in your culture, because we can also see when people immigrate, for instance, from South America to North America, they're happier than people in the US with the same socioeconomic background. So there's something in your sauce. You need to tell us what's going on. There's also secrets, I think, in Latin America. Muy bien. Yeah, you love the crisis. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, family, right? Yeah. Yes. So I don't know where the microphones went. All right, so the lady on your right.
I'm a little bit concerned with the unemployment thing that you showed us in the graph. Is this about when you're downsizing and people are leaving your company? Is there anything we can do to alleviate this? Is it people who do get a job afterwards because they were fired or they were let go? Does this continue? If you can explain that a little bit more,
yeah,
especially for us as business people.
Right, so what I showed you was if people remain unemployed. So in a 4-year period afterwards, if they're still unemployed, then it's really low. if people get a new employment, if they get a new job, we can actually see that there is a footprint. Even when they regain a new job, regain their identity, regain source of income and so on, they're still a little bit less happy compared to people that were not fired. So you are scarred in a little way if you become unemployed. I don't know what the answer is to that. Also, my country, we have a flexicurity system. That means that it's quite easy for companies to fire people, which is good from a business point of view because you can quickly adjust when the economy is going up or down. But of course, then people are let off, and that's the security element, that there is generous unemployment benefits. We can also see, just to add a nuance to your question, is it matters what's happening for your peers. So we can see unemployed people, there's a higher risk of suicide. But there's a higher risk of suicide if you're unemployed in an area where there's low unemployment, which is a paradox because you would think it would be easier to find new employment. But here we are, what our Mexican friend let us know before, social comparisons again. So if you are the only one unemployed, then you start to question there's something wrong with me. If 50% of the population is unemployed, then there's something wrong with the economy. So the narrative in the two places means that in this situation, we have a higher suicide risk from unemployment. That was not an answer to what you said, but it's showing the complexity and importance of this area. I can see we've run out of time. I'll be here for the rest of the afternoon, so come grab me and ask your wonderful questions. And thank you so much for coming.